Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for the warmth of your welcome, and it's very good to be speaking to you today. The Dean said he was my warm-up act, so I hope this isn't too much of an anticlimax, but I'm going to reflect with you really on George Herbert and the Liturgy of Holy Communion in the Prayer Book. And if you've been to Bemerton Church, as I'm sure some of you at least will have done, just outside Salisbury, and sat quietly amidst the ancient stone and wood of that holy little place, you can't help but hear within the beating of a faithful heart the rhythms of common prayer echoing down the centuries from the lips of that holy country parson to your own prayers at some 8 o'clock altar in cathedral or parish church. The fact that George Herbert, like his near contemporary John Donne, was also a poet will not be lost on those of you who love the poetry of liturgy and find within the cadences of the prayer book a timelessness that refuses to be dated and a familiarity that refuses to be alienated. That the prayer book's conversations with God are close up and familiar may indeed be lost on those who merely stumble upon the prayer book by chance. But those of us gathered here know that if we stumble upon a Yorkshire farmer standing at his gate, he will address us as you and his neighbour as thee. The earthiness of the Book of Common Prayer is more likely to be the reason for its survival and validity in worship today than anything more erudite or highfalutin than that. Simon Armitage, the current Poet Laureate, recently reflected on the art of poetry and advised wannabe poets to avoid poetic language. He knew a poem was going to be bad if the writer employed the word midst when locating themselves in a garden or orchard surrounded by trees. Although the liturgy is indeed a foretaste of heaven, it must also earth us if we are to recognise flesh and blood in the person of the incarnate God and the sacrament of Holy Communion. In his poem, The Priesthood, George Herbert talks of the priest at the altar serving up God, almost, but inevitably not quite, like a cook serves up our dinner. He writes, "But the holy men of God such vessels are as serve him up, who all the world commands. When God vouchsafeth to become our fare, their hands convey him who conveys their hands. O what pure things, most pure must those things be, who brings my God to me." Herbert writes this poem as a reflection of his own internal wrangling over the question of whether he should be ordained or not. This well-born, one-time politician may not be worthy of the purity required of the one who dispenses God's grace in the Holy Communion. But John Donne was persuaded by James I to be ordained, and no one could accuse John Donne of not having earthiness and to spare in his own life and work. Herbert's wrestling with his own inadequacy is perhaps the hallmark of a good priest. For inadequacy, read humility. For humility, read earthiness. For earthiness, read incarnation. And it is the Word made flesh that creates the pathway to redemption in the death and resurrection of Jesus, God's last and final word about absolutely everything. Thomas Cranmer is not a contemporary of either Herbert or Donne by several generations, nor is he a poet. We have poeticized him because of our love of the language of the Book of Common Prayer. But he is certainly a wordsmith and believes in the intrinsic sin of the common man and in the power of the Word made flesh to redeem him. As a precentor, I'm caught up in the choreography of liturgy on a daily basis, even when Bibles are held up in customs. We clergy, hesitant or eager as the case may be, swear to use only those forms of service which are authorised or allowed by canon, to which I occasionally want to add Hampel. But one of you is quite quick. Thank you, the rest of you, because I'm far too humble to do that. Although the rules concerning the liturgy may rely on team players and a certain degree at least of humility, they can be sold to the disdainful by encouraging people to believe that the rules concerning the liturgy prevent the liturgy from relying solely on the priest, and remind both priest and people that the minister of religion is merely a channel of God's grace dispensed through the ministry of the church. The priest speaks with authority in a pale imitation of that authority which impressed Jesus' listeners so much, solely because they are a channel rather than a dam. And that's why I still call myself a clerk in holy orders when I fill in a passport application form, because rather like a bank clerk, I dispense riches not my own. And the rules to order the liturgy in the Book of Common Prayer are almost as poetic as the liturgy itself, such that when George Herbert came to write the poem that says it all, we hear in its word painting remarkable echoes of both liturgy and rubric, and all from the order for Holy Communion. The poem that says it all makes me therefore return to the altar at Bemerton Church and conjure up George Herbert presiding at Holy Communion according to the Book of Common Prayer, as it is my privilege to do on occasion here at Durham Cathedral, standing in a church still largely ordered by Cranmer's 17th century editor John Cousin, and here in Herbert's poem Love Bade Me Welcome, the liturgy and rubrics of Holy Communion. For it is the earthiness of this service that in which we receive true redemption as God is served up by the priest, the channel of God's grace. Love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. A guest, I answered, worthy to be here. Love said, you shall be he. I, the unkind, ungrateful, oh, my dear, I cannot look on thee. Love took my hand and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I've marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And know you not, says love, who bore the blame? My dear, then I will serve. You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. Stephen Sykes, one time Van Mildert Professor of Divinity here at Durham, and then Bishop of Ely, and then Principal of St. John's College down the road, drew an adroit analogy between this glorious poem about the love feast of the Eucharist and the pages of the Holy Communion service in the Book of Common Prayer, which I share with you now as a means of conveying the way in which George Herbert was drenched in the liturgy of the Book of Common Prayer, was a humble and faithful priest, and understood that our attendance at the divine service is a response to grace rather than a means of earning it. The Eucharistic act of thanksgiving, Sunday by Sunday, is an eternal thank you letter to God. And so we hear the prayer book cadences with which we started in the poem we've just heard. In the exhortation to the negligent, we read the following. I intend by God's grace to celebrate the Lord's Supper, unto which in God's behalf I bid you all that are here present, being so lovingly called and bidden by God himself. Love bade me welcome. And in the exhortation preceding, we read, consider the great peril of the unworthy receiving thereof, and so to search and examine your own consciences. Yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. And in the exhortation at the communion we read, when God calleth you, are ye not ashamed to say ye will not come? But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. Later on in the exhortation at the communion, we read, so is the danger great if we receive the same unworthily. A guest, I answered, worthy to be here. And in the invitation to confession, the liturgy itself, ye that do truly and earnestly repent you of your sins, draw near with faith and take this holy sacrament to your comfort. Love said, you shall be he. And then in the general confession, we acknowledge and bewail our manifold sins and wickedness. I, the unkind, ungrateful, my dear, I cannot look on thee. And in the Sursum Corda, lift up your hearts. Love took me by the hand, and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? And in the prayer of humble access, we do not presume to come to this thy table to gather up the crumbs under thy table. Truth, Lord, but I've marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And in the prayer of consecration, who made there by his one oblation of himself once offered. And know you not, says love, who bore the blame? And in the rubric at the distribution, then shall the minister first receive the communion and then proceed to deliver the same to the people. My dear, then I will serve. You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. Stephen Sykes draws that brilliant analogy between that glorious poem of George Herbert and the phrases which are so familiar to us gathered here in the Liturgy of Holy Communion in the Book of Common Prayer. The George Herbert who is drenched in that liturgy, both the liturgy and its rubrics. When we attend Holy Communion, we experience an opportunity for revelation in an act of worship which travels in two directions, just like the conversation in that poem of George Herbert's, travelling in two directions as it ascribes honour to God and receives dignity from God. Holy Communion is a foretaste of heaven in which the mind and characters of the worshippers may shape the liturgy, but the liturgy also shapes them. Someone once said, "We make worship and worship makes us." And for one as a precentor who tries to plan liturgy in advance, I'm also mindful of the line in one of the prefaces of the resource books of common worship: liturgy is not liturgy until you do it. And for those of us who make worship professionally, the intention of the liturgist must lead to an encounter with God in the service, which informs the understanding of the worshippers and determines their experience. Love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. A guest, I answered, worthy to be here. Love said, you shall be he. I, the unkind, ungrateful, my dear, I cannot look on thee. Love took me by the hand and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And know you not, says love, who bore the blame? My dear, then I will serve. You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. Thank you very much indeed for listening to me.